I'm Shiva, and this week on AnimeCons TV, I'm going to help you, all those cosplayers and prop makers out there, get organized with your materials and all that stuff that you've managed to accumulate that helps you make all these awesome things for this crazy hobby that we have. I am kind of crazy about organization. It's just the way I'm personality-wise, and I've helped some of my friends out. So I'm going to share some of my techniques with you, which hopefully can translate to no matter what kind of space you have. Maybe it's a dorm room or an apartment, or maybe you're lucky enough to have a house of your own and you can dedicate some more space to it, or even if you're still living with your parents. I think that some of these skills will help, and hopefully you can use them to straighten up your area as well. My first recommendation is when you're trying to kind of clean up an area and get organized is to start with the actual supplies rather than your costumes or your actual physical props, just because that's kind of a less intimidating task. Your supplies, usually they're smaller, they're probably scattered all over the place, and there's kind of a lot of different categories, and when you're making something, it's the most frustrating thing when you can't find the supplies to make it. Like, where did I put the glue, and where did I put, I know I have this thread, and sometimes because you can't find it, you end up buying stuff that you don't need, that you already had, and then you find it later and it just turns a little crazy. And I think it's easier for your supplies to get disorganized, especially when you're in a rush. So the first strategy that I use is I recommend buying these small plastic tubs. You can find them anywhere, Target, Walmart. They're not expensive. They're usually a couple of bucks each. Sometimes you can find, I get these all on sale, so they're only about $1 each. And what's nice about them is they're small and they're stackable, so they can fit pretty much in any area. They also fit really great in these metal cubbies that a lot of people have. Like if you're a college kid especially, you see these a lot. And what's nice about that is instead of stacking maybe 6 or 7 boxes on top of each other, each cubby holds 2. So if I want something that's all the way at the bottom, I don't have to move all the other boxes off of it in order to get to the stuff that I need, which is always a pain. When I started organizing, I just bought a whole bunch of these boxes and I spread them around the room. We took all the stuff out because you have to make it worse to make it better. We made a huge mess, and took all the supplies out, and we started sorting them into categories. What categories you actually use depends on the stuff you have and also how much of it you have. For example, we decided to do a category called adhesives, and what we have in here is basically any kind. We have glue sticks, all sorts of tapes, duct tape, reflective tape, all sorts of gem glue, tacky glue, pretty much all the kind of adhesives you might have around the house, contact cement, and even our glue gun, Elmer's glue, and it all fit into this box. And so now what's great about this is when we're doing a cosplay, or even when we're just going around our house and we need tape or something, we know exactly where to find it. Sometimes you might not have enough of one thing to fill a box, and you can save some space. So for example, I have one box that is just, I have a hat, that is just serger thread, because it takes up a lot of room and we have a ton of it at this point because we have a serger and we've made a lot of different things with different colors. But with regular thread, it really didn't take up all that much room. So instead, we used some cardboard and we use it to divide a box so that we have threads of multicolors on one side and then our neutral color threads on the other side, and then we managed to take this part and fill it with other kind of sewing accessories like bias tape, and extra zippers that we haven't used yet, unopened bias tape. It's pretty much just bias tape and zippers, but also some fray check, a little sewing kit that we take at conventions, and a fabric fusion pin. So pretty much all those little things you need when you're sewing all go in one place. And that's pretty much what we did for all of these kind of medium-sized boxes. And then we labeled them all so that we know exactly what we're looking for and not have to go searching through it. Some of the other things we have is craft supplies. We have one box just for resin, resin casting. We have one for fabric paint and dye, so anything that we're using to color fabric. I know I have one for my patterns, Sketch has one for his patterns. We don't have that many, so one box for each of us works, but for some people you might need a bunch of boxes. Maybe you have one just for dress patterns or another one for historical patterns or something like that. It doesn't matter. You can change the categories to fit what you're doing. Now let's go take a look at how we organize some of the smaller supplies that wouldn't really make sense to put in a large box like this. Alright, so over here we have where we keep our smaller supplies, things like safety pins, empty bobbins, rub and buff, those little gems that you get for all these sorts of things, little wire clippings, buttons, all sorts of the kind of stuff that really wouldn't make sense to put in a large box. Now what these actually are, if you haven't seen them before, they're sold in hardware stores, and they're for tools in your tool shed, things like nails, screws, all that kind of stuff you would use in woodworking or in your shop. They're perfect size-wise for the stuff that you need for your small cosplay supplies. So for example, let me pull one of these out here. Here we have all of our needles, because I know I used to always constantly lose needles, and then when I wanted some I couldn't find any. So all of our sewing needles are in here. And here we have bobbins. And here we have, you know, beads that we worked with that didn't finish. You never use them all. You always have too many. And then if you need it for something else, there they are. If you don't have enough space for this, you don't have enough stuff to really justify having a large container like that. These are actually two stacked on top of each other. These small little containers, they almost look like giant pill containers for people who have maybe grandparents that have those pill containers. But they sell these at Joann's, and they snap open, and they're great for not just transporting things like beads and buttons and you know, hooks for earrings, things like that, but they're also easy to transport and nothing falls out of them. So sometimes, even if you have something large like this, you might want to invest in a couple of these, so that way if you have to bring extra supplies maybe to the convention, maybe you're afraid like beads are going to pop off or buttons and you want extra, or even just a way to carry things that you're definitely going to need like safety pins. They're a great way to store those, and you can just stick them in your suitcase and you don't have to worry about everything kind of falling all over itself and getting mixed up. Now this is a little hard to see because we keep these, you know, hidden under a bed. They work good under a desk, things like that. Is for probably one of the biggest supplies that you have if you're a cosplayer is fabric, and we have tons of fabric. Whether we bought it because we planned to make something and haven't made it yet, or we had extra, or people gave it to us, we always seem to have a lot of that, and it takes up a lot of room. So what I recommend is you get large tubs like these. You can tell ours are overflowing. And you same thing, get these at like Target, and start separating your fabric into some categories. So take all the fabric you have and start sorting. And we make basically 3 piles. We make costume fabric that we're going to keep, construction fabric, that's your things like muslin, interfacing, and then maybe good fabric that we don't want to throw away but we're not going to use for anything, so maybe we can use it for mock-ups. And then the third category is stuff to throw away or to give away, because either you're never going to make it, you're not going to use it for anything, you don't see any use for it in any of the costumes in your head you've planned to make, it might be time to unload it. And if it's nice and you don't want to throw it out, you might want to go to do a fabric swap with your friends, and maybe someone else really needs it for something that they're planning on making, and there's a way you can get rid of it there and not feel like you're throwing it out. So once you've separated your fabric, what I recommend doing is we keep a separate one for, and this is construction fabric. We have our interfacing in here. We also put quilting batting, because that's, you always need that. And then all that fabric that we didn't want to throw away that we use for mock-ups, especially sometimes, you know, if you use that muslin or thin fabric for your regular mock-ups, sometimes you're trying to make something stiff like a corset or a jacket, and it just doesn't hang right when you try to make it out of muslin as a mock-up. So to make sure everything's hanging properly, you might want to use a thicker fabric, but you don't want to pay much for it. So if you have kind of a reserve of nice fabric that you don't really want to use for anything, sometimes it makes excellent mock-up fabric, and then you feel like you've gotten a use out of it. And then we put that in a separate box. That way when you're trying to make a mock-up or, you know, plan out your costume, you're not digging through all your other fabric trying to find it and maybe using the first thing you find. You actually have a dedicated space for it. We actually, because Sketch makes a lot of things with leather and he's really into leatherworking, we actually have an entire bin of just leather. Because it's so expensive, he doesn't like to throw scraps of it away unless they're really small and completely useless, because sometimes you can make things like pouches and satchels and belts. We actually made belts for our Final Fantasy IX characters at Anime Boston this past year out of his scrap leather fabric. So we have a separate bin for that. So if there's a certain kind of fabric that you have an incredible amount of that you want to keep separate, and it can fill up a bin like this, that's another perfect way to do it. Some people do it because they have a ton of petticoats. I know Elizabeth does that. She has an entire bin just for her petticoat so that they're separate, and that when she needs one for a certain costume, she can go right to that place and go through the ones she has. She doesn't have to go through all this other unrelated stuff to find them. Sometimes these kind of bins also work really well for kind of medium-sized props that you know, big props, things like swords and staffs and stuff, they're not going to really fit in something like here. But sometimes things like wings, small swords, we have those are common eyeglasses. Things like that. And we usually try to stick to, I don't know how common I got in here, but we usually try to stick to accessories, tambourine, boomerangs, the flags we use when we did the Hogwarts founders. Things that are kind of medium-sized but they aren't really part of your costume. They're just something you carry around. And that's kind of a good distinction to make when you're separating your stuff. That way, when you're trying to find a prop, which you carry around, versus an accessory, which is something that's usually pretty critical to your costume, you're not looking through the same stuff. Finally, we'll talk about how you actually put away your costumes, which sometimes is the hardest part. Okay, so now you have all of your supplies organized. Now what do you do with your actual costumes and props that are finished, and you need to store them so they don't get wrecked? You know, if you want to wear them again, obviously spend all this work on it. You don't want to just wear them to one convention and then throw them in a corner, and then you're losing half their stuff, or they get destroyed after you put all that effort into them. This is probably the hardest part about organizing your costume stuff, because this actually does require a lot of room. There's not a lot of tricks you can take with storing your actual costumes, depending on how large of a costume they are. Sketch and I are still in the process of this, because when we got married, we bought a house together, so we not only have to move all of our stuff, but we have to combine all of our stuff, which is horrible, because you're taking an entire costumes player's stuff and props and costumes and trying to combine them with someone else's and decide there's enough room for them. And it's very difficult, but there are some tricks. Again, we use some of these little boxes. You can see them all stacked up around here. And what we did is we used them for the costume supplies that you can actually put away. So for example, we have this whole box that's just for makeup and the kind of stuff you put on your face. So spray hair dye, elf ears, you know, all that stuff that you actually have to get to wear on yourself. Things like prop earrings, that kind of thing, all goes in here. So that way when we're packing for the convention, and we're packing, usually we put it in our emergency repair kit or whatever we're putting in our makeup bag, we just rifle through here and we know it's in here somewhere. Similarly, in some of those boxes we put wigs. I have my wigs divided by color because I have so many at this point that I have an entire box that's just black wigs, and another one that's brown, another one that's red, and another one that's like cartoony colors, things like that. I just divide them up, and this works great for the wigs that can be stored flat, and so they're all in one place, and if I'm looking for a color, I don't have to go searching through my entire wig collection. Once upon a time when I didn't have as many costumes, I used to keep the wig with the costume, like maybe in a bag that was hung over the hanger or something like that. But so many of my wigs I use for multiple costumes now that it got really confusing as to which one it was with and how could I dig it out to go find it. The keeping them separate is actually, I found, a lot easier. The other things we put in there, we put things like headgear, so crowns, headbands, feathers, little accessories, sometimes the small Alita hats, those kind of things we fit in there. We have a box that's all gloves because, wow, we have a ton of gloves. Those are the kind of things you can combine. If you don't have a lot of them, you can just say, like, you know, accessories, small accessories, you know, and put them all together. And sometimes we also have a box for smaller props. We have one that's all guns. All those prop guns we have that filled up an entire box. And there's another one just for leather accessories because we have a ton of those that fit. So that's some way to categorize everything. Basically, the way you want to think about it when you're trying to divide it up is, if I need something, where would I look for it? Like, what would I call it? How would I divide it up? So that if I'm in a hurry and I'm trying to find it, what would my brain do to look for it? With the bigger stuff, you have less options. So we found this way that we would just hang up our hats. So we put these little posts. right here. You can see they're just wooden and they're nailed into the wall. This wall isn't so great. We're probably going to redo them, so they're kind of not very securely in there right now. But they work in a pinch, and we'll redo that later. We have a corner where we put all of our large swords, you know, my Madoka bow. And then in this corner, in between all of our boxes, we're able to store some of our larger props, like my Songo boomerang, Lynx's scythe right here. And then at some point, you're going to need a closet. If you don't have a closet, if you don't have a lot of room, sometimes a rack works really well to hang up the costumes that need to be hung up. If you have costumes that can be folded, and some costumes are better to be folded, you can put them in those plastic tubs. That works just as well, and then you can stack them. Some costumes that are pretty much just basically clothes and they're easy to iron, you can fold. Other ones, like I know my Arwen dresses, they're so heavy that actually the hanger pulls on the shoulder and can damage the sleeves because it would actually stretch it out. So they're actually folded up and you can just iron them. Otherwise, you have to hang them up. What we've found out is that the best thing to do, because otherwise they get dusty and wrecked, is to actually put these plastic bags on them. And these are actually just trash bags that we cut a hole into the top for the hanger, and then they're open at the bottom. And these work incredibly well, and since they're really long, sometimes they're longer than the costume, so we just cut off the bottom. And the best part about these is when we're transporting the costumes to a convention, sometimes we don't even have to pack them. We can just kind of tie the hangers together. They're already in protective plastic, and then we can tie the bottom off so nothing falls out. And then we can always, you know, get the accessories out of the boxes, put them in a plastic bag, and hang them on the hanger, but inside the bag. So if anything were to get away, it's going to fall out. It's not going to fall at the bottom because we've tied off the bottom. This worked really well if we were going to KatsuCon and it was snowing like crazy. Nothing got damaged because it was already in the plastic. Now this wouldn't work obviously if you're traveling on an aircraft to the convention, but for all of the local ones that we have, we prefer not to have to stuff them in a suitcase if we don't have to, and this works really well. Shoes are always a huge problem. We have ours up on a shelf up here. You can also use those metal cubes to kind of stack them all. We're kind of in the process of doing that so that we can fit more of them. And that's pretty much it. It works for a lot of stuff, and you'd be surprised how much more space you have and also how much time you save scrambling, both when you're constructing the costume and then also when you're packing to a convention, when you can kind of find everything. Now everything always does get into a disarray while you're making the costume. Like in the rush before the convention, we usually leave this house with this stuff scattered all over the place. You can't always keep track of it during the process, but when we come home after we go to bed and maybe rest for a day, we come back and put everything back into these boxes right away. So we'll spend the night, maybe the day after we get home, organizing everything so it goes back into the boxes it was supposed to be in. Any new stuff we bought that's lying around goes into a proper location so that in the future we have it. So I hope that was helpful. I hope you're able to use some of these to apply to your own collection and maybe get yourself organized and save yourself some time. See you next week.